All right, the book of the week from last week that I'll talk about tonight is The Secrets of Words by Noam Chomsky and Andrea Moro. This is a book that just came out that it's really two parts. The bigger part at the beginning is a conversation between these two, Noam Chomsky and Andrea Moro. Noam Chomsky, of course, came up with some very, very impactful, monumental theories related to language acquisition, and how humans understand language that was in opposition to some of the arguments presented by many linguists at the time, including the behaviorists especially, which I'll talk a bit about. Andrea Moro also has done research on linguistics, and he's a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Pavia, Italy. And this book was an interesting conversation between two heavyweights in the field of linguistics. And, Chomsky has made many impacts intellectually, but when it comes to language and language acquisition, we can understand some of what he contributed as basically saying that humans have a universal and, in a sense, innate ability to acquire language. That it's as if our brains have some ability, component. I don't want to say module, because sometimes we think of the brain in these ways where it's like this part does this, where really it seems that it's always going to be much more complicated than that. But that essentially, to use a machine type of a term, we're equipped to learn languages. It's not just like learning other things, as they talk about in the book, like learning how to learn the rules of a game. It's not the same way that we learn the rules of grammar. It seems to be something more innate and universal than that. Andrea Moro has done some interesting research on what he calls impossible languages, and he has a book of the same name where he describes his research on these things he calls impossible languages, which I'll get into in a moment. And so there's this conversation they have about things related to linguistics, but also looking at science, the history of science in certain aspects, also the optimism we've seen in science in different periods, and how it's often a little bit optimistic and thinks that we can solve all the problems, or we figured it all out because of some new discovery, some new technology, some new theory. And time and time again we see that the full picture is much more complex, and so we seek this capital T truth to know what's going on or how to explain something, but we're always going to be left with a smaller T truth that might get bigger and that we understand more. But it does seem that to expect that we can understand the whole world, or even one aspect of the world fully, might be a bit naive and short-sighted. So as I mentioned, Noam Chomsky's did a lot of work in many different fields. When it comes to linguistics, he's also a heavyweight in that he contributed significantly in our understanding. And of course, every theory of these sorts has criticisms, and some people agree and some disagree, and some aspects of the theories tend to be proven more right or more wrong over time. But really his contributions were significant. And so Andrea Moro's work, looking at, as I mentioned, impossible languages, which I'll explain the best I can right now, seems to support some of Chomsky's thoughts that it's the syntax and these rules that we have that are innate for humans that help us understand language, not just some kind of rule acquisition or trial and error learning that the behaviorists thought. So maybe I'll add that there. For the behaviorists, and B.F. Skinner is known as one of the heavyweights in that field and that school of thought, the thinking was that everything we do is just from essentially reinforcements and punishments, where the things that get rewarded or reinforced we're more likely to do, the things that don't get rewarded or might get punished we're less likely to do. And that's essentially how any organism, including humans, learn anything, to do anything. And so this is where a lot of research was being done on different types of reinforcement and seeing how it could make animals do certain things, from salivating that was happening automatically to the sound of a bell if it was then presented with I think it was meat powder, some kind of food for the dogs, this Pavlov's dogs, which was a famous and hallmark study that helped us understand that type of reinforcement that's automatic, to more systematic ways of getting animals, for example, to do something. So if you see an animal at a circus doing a trick, often it's through these types of reinforcements where they slowly get the animal to do one step, then the next, and then eventually they can do a whole series. Definitely not condoning circus animals and the treatment of them, but that's one of the things that was being done, was getting animals to do certain things. So that type of thinking was then thought to be part of every kind of behavior, including language. And so Chomsky was saying, no, this is not the case, that it's not just something that we learn like everything else. And really, when you look at what babies do and then growing into toddlers, it doesn't seem like what they're doing is based on trial and error learning alone. It seems like there's something more innate going on. And so Andrea Moro was showing that these impossible languages were essentially languages that could make some kind of logical sense. Let's say, for example, that when we are understanding a sentence, everything that matters is the linear order. So this word, if it precedes this word, means this is related to that in that kind of an order. And we see that that's not the case. So, for example, if I say that, Tom went to the store with Sarah and he you know that the he is talking about Tom and not about Sarah, even though her name was closer to that word. And so the Chomsky was impressed by this, that we in some ways ignore so much of what we experience when we hear something, and we have some rules, it seems like, that are hierarchical, that help us understand rather than by the order alone. And so in these impossible languages, Moro was having subjects do these types of experiments, learning these new languages, either languages that existed already, like someone who's German learning Japanese, or learning words that don't have meaning. So the semantics don't make sense, but you can understand the sentence. And they found that people do better with the quote-unquote possible languages versus the impossible languages. And they also did brain scans, and they found that when people were learning a new possible language, meaning it's like how we understand language using syntax, parts of the brain around the Broca's area and related to language were lit up. But when they were learning these more linear types of languages that were the quote-unquote impossible languages, other parts were being lit up in the brain, which essentially was more like the brain was trying to solve a problem rather than just perceive something, in a sense. That's how I understood. And so it is a little bit convoluted, and it's not to say that it's convoluted just because it's confusing, because it is. Also, my understanding of it will be limited. I was newly exposed to this idea of these impossible languages, but it gave some more credence to the fact that the way we understand language seems to be more universal than just learning rules. And we see that for practically all human languages, I think they say all, I say it practically in case, I don't know, or there is something out there showing otherwise, follow these types of rules, which seems to imply that that's the case. And from my understanding, even things like sign language, which is not a written language per se, also follow those. So that to me is quite fascinating to see that research and hear their conversation, again, or read their conversation, I should say, to see what they were saying about language and what they understood about it. Now, they also, as I mentioned, talk about science and the history of science in different ways. Chomsky talks about in the 50s some insights about linguistics and other fields that made people overly optimistic, in the sense that they thought that they were going to figure everything out and it was going to be simple going forward. And he said he makes a comparison to what he sees now with things like big data and AI, that Thursday thought said, okay, now that we have these means of learning or of advancing our understanding of things, it's going to make it so easy to solve every problem, and we're going to know everything soon. And he sees that same kind of naive optimism, in the sense that we think we're going to figure it all out. And I think this is a reminder of having that type of epistemic humility, intellectual humility, that we can't figure all these things out. And even if we think something makes so much sense using a theory we have, it doesn't mean the theory is necessarily right. Things feel right until they're wrong, or things that are right feel the same way as something that's wrong. You can't really tell just because it feels right. And so people have had theories to explain everything. Okay, if we leave meat out and it goes rotten, it seems like maggots just spontaneously generate. And that was a concept several hundred years ago, spontaneous generation, not realizing it was something else going on. It wasn't that it was coming to life from the flesh that was rotting, but that either those eggs were there or they were getting placed or fell there or something like that was bringing the maggots. But it made sense that there was spontaneous generation. And so we see this happening throughout history. Or I was thinking, and they talk about gravity. And really, for a lot of our intuitive sense of how things work, we tend to not think an object that is far away from another object can influence that object. We'd think that, yes, if you're touching or if you're grabbing or moving, you can move the other object. But gravity, in the way that it works between sphere, like, the Earth and the Moon, let's say, they're affecting each other from far away. The Moon is far away, but it's affecting the tides. And so if someone had told me that and I had never heard it before or heard scientists say that that was true, I would think it sounds kind of crazy. What do you mean the moon is making the waves or changing the way the waves, where the tides go and things like that? That doesn't make any sense. The moon's all the way over here. The oceans are here. It can't be the case. Or because of the moon or the sun, word changes the way we as the earth move. And not only that, the earth is moving and flying at some speed around the sun, even though it looks like the sun is going up and down every day. And that's why there's been these intuitive theories, or theories that seem to make sense, but that were not right, because how we perceive things is going to always be very limited. So I found that part of the discussion fascinating as well, hearing them discuss some, of course, as scientists, they themselves are always trying to advance things, but the humility that we can have of recognizing we're trying to get to our best understanding, but it doesn't mean we completely understand anything yet. And always we think, things feel so modern now, and we look back like, oh, look at how backwards things were from the ways they thought to the technologies they had and all those things. And of course, because things haven't advanced past today, that's not possible. There's this sense that we've reached some kind of limit or we've reached the pinnacle, when of course that's not the case. So it could be good to remember those things as well. So it's a pretty interesting book, very short one, a quick read about language in some ways, but more than just that. I got it because I saw Noam Chomsky get a new book, so I was like, I have to get it, and checked it out, and hope you will too. That was The Secret of Words by Noam Chomsky and Andrea Moro. Let's go to our first commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. So in the first segment, I was talking about the book The Secrets of Words by Noam Chomsky and Andrea Moro, and they discussed aspects of linguistics and research related to linguistics, but other topics as well. And when I saw the title of the book, The Secrets of Words, I thought it was going to be even more about words and meanings and things of that sort specifically, and with things like political correctness and pronouns and different things that have become very hot button issues. I thought it might be more in that realm, but it was more generally about language, and as I mentioned, different aspects of science came up in their conversation as well. The second part of the book, Andrea Moro, it was kind of like a recap of their conversation, but also extending it further and going more in depth into his thoughts on Chomsky's contributions to linguistics and our understandings of it. But a note on words themselves, and actually something that Andrea Moro says at the end of the book. I've myself said languages evolve, I think. He said, and I think it makes sense, that it's not, there's a difference between saying something evolves and something changes. So he does say languages change, but they don't necessarily evolve, because evolved means they're becoming more advanced, and languages aren't necessarily becoming more advanced, but they do change. So that aspect of it is still, I can understand to be true. I think I can understand this distinction between those two. But languages do change. If you look at something from 200 years ago, you'll notice there's some things that will change in the words that are used. The meanings of words can even change slightly and evolve. over time. There are some things, of course, in his research looking at impossible languages, some things that won't change or might change but won't become something totally different, that they have to still follow certain rules that are part of this essentially universal grammar, so to speak. Again, I'm not sure if it's of every language, but that practically every language. But that part of words changing, or that they can change, to me is something interesting and something worth noting, because in taking a step back, people talk about words and they'll say, well, it's just words. Well, words don't matter. You can't get upset about words, or you can't feel something about words. And I completely disagree with that, because the whole point of having words is to communicate things, which includes facts and ideas in a very abstract way, but also to convey emotion and feelings, and every word has feelings embedded in it. And this is why sometimes when we talk about lost in translation, lots of things can happen. So you might say, let's say a word in Persian and English, and they feel different to you, even though it's the same word for that same whatever. Let's say it's even an item or thing or a type of feeling. And so actually the book I'll read this week, looking at culture and feelings, I'm sure we'll get into this even more in depth. But when we look at words, if we just think they just mean something as in like an object, they do. That's part of what they mean, but they always will mean more than that. There's these things that are connotations to that word that we connect to it, and they really happen automatically. And it could be a lot of things. For you personally, maybe a certain word, you've heard it in Persian but not English, or in Persian it was said by someone very loving or important to you or had some meaning, or when you were a kid you heard it because you went to school in Iran and now you're in America, so you don't hear that same word, or if you hear it, it won't bring up those feelings that maybe for someone who grew up in the United States would feel for that same word because they heard it in school, let's say. So individually, words have meanings to us, but then of course for it to have any value, a language has to be something collective. I can't just say, well, I'm going to start just on my show saying boop, bop, beep, dit, mat, and to me it has a lot of meaning. I could do that. I hope you would stop listening pretty soon, but if I did that, you wouldn't understand what I'm saying, or I wouldn't be able to convey anything to you. The whole point is I have to use words that we have as a shared language that allows for it to have some type of currency, some type of meaning. And this is why I actually think the analogy between money and language has some overlap, in the sense that both are socially constructed. Language is a social construction that gets created over time. Now, it doesn't mean that, as was talked about in the book, that our brains just learned it as anything else. We do seem to have a certain proclivity to understand language. The way I think about that, actually, I was going to mention this in the first segment, it's kind of like how our eyes see things, right? We perceive things, but we have a special ability or affinity towards faces. And so we notice faces better in more detail. They bring up more feelings for us. There's even, I think it's the fusiform gyrus or fusiform face gyrus, a part of the brain that seems to be associated with face recognition. Even if you look at the outlets in the United States, like the electrical outlets, not talking about shopping, electrical outlets, and it's like, two dots and a little circle. And for a lot of people, if you look at that, it kind of looks like a face. I don't know if you've noticed that. For a lot of people, they see a face. You see two eyes, and it kind of looks like an open mouth, maybe like you're shocked or something or surprised. But that's because we have this proclivity to see faces even when they're not there, because they are so important for us. So you see this in a lot of ways, that people will see faces in objects or things when it's not a face, because we have this proclivity. And so we have this way of understanding or perceiving faces in a way that we might not perceive other objects the same way. And so similarly, language is something that we seem to be equipped to learn, essentially all humans, to learn language in a particular way, and especially in a particular time window of our development, we can be even more sensitive to it to understand it more deeply. And so because of that, it seems that we are equipped to learn language. So it's not like anything else that we learn. But coming back to this analogy between language and money, it's something that's socially constructed, language. And so is money. It's socially constructed. It only has value if others also give it value. The reason why the money in my pocket has value for me, or I know it has value, is because I know it has value for you. And we create a system that has some way of measuring it in other things or comparing it to other things. But it has a socially constructed value. Now, again, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean something. I talked about this last week in relationship to things like race and other things that automatically bring up feelings. You might think, well, no, when I think of money, I feel something. It's not like it because of other people or anything like that, but that's how we internalize things over time. It just feels intrinsic, the value of money, but it's because of the social values and social construct. The other thing I like about the analogy between language and money is that just how money can change value in a variety of ways. A certain currency, let's say, can change value. So I think the dollar and the euro are much closer now in value as they were before. Individual words can change value over time as well, whether they are more positive or negative, whether they mean different things. Those things will change over time. And as they change, it becomes more automatic, and it can be hard to remember the previous connotation of it before that. So, for example, Google, which is, of course, this huge company, or I think the company's name is Alphabet, but Google is part of that company, is such a common word that we use in talking about the company, and also in using the search engine, that we say just Google it is a noun, a verb now, I mean, to say that. But Google is a one with 100 zeros after it. It's a number. And I remember when I was younger, actually a very, very good family friend, Arash, taught me that. Arash told me that he was maybe 4 years older than me. So when I was young, he said, oh yeah, what's one with 100 zeros? It's a Google. That's the number, a Google. And I was like, oh, cool. And back then, that's always what it meant. But it actually wasn't, I almost forgot that was the number after so many years of Google being this company. And when you hear Google, you don't think of this number. You think of the big company and other things and however it might relate to your life. And so that original meaning of the word, of a certain number, kind of loses its meaning to you, or that word doesn't have that meaning anymore. So just like a currency can change value, or a currency can become obsolete, we're seeing that with things like cryptocurrency, which also, again, will show us this sense that currencies are a social construct. They go up and down based on how other people value them and a host of other factors. But really, what's the intrinsic value of it? Really nothing. Or it's hard to say it has some kind of intrinsic value in and of itself. But that's the same thing we see with language, that we can't say it. A word like book, I'm looking at a book in front of me, has value, but it's because we've made the word book and that sound of book, and then also the spelling of it in that word, to mean this thing that I'm holding in my hand that you can't see right now, but because of words I can convey to you what I'm doing. Or you can imagine now this scene. I can tell you I'm holding this small black book in my hand, talking into the microphone, and now you have a visual image of what is going on as I'm speaking these words. So the words that I'm speaking help you understand what it might look like as I'm speaking these words. So we can see how powerful, incredible language is. But sometimes we do it. I think this also points to how natural it is, the way that we speak, that we forget the things that are so natural. Another aspect of language that can be interesting to look at how natural it is. So if you hear me say, how are you doing today? You probably in your mind heard that as these discrete things. How are you doing today? Like 5 different things. But really, if we were to just play the sound of what I said, it was maybe 1 or 2 sounds that could be broken up. And this is actually why if you hear a language you don't know and you hear someone speaking, you can't say how many words they spoke. But in English, let's say if that's a language you speak, it happens automatically that you hear the different words as separate, distinct things, even though the sound that's being created won't be able to be separated in those different types of parts. I even experienced this in Farsi, which to say I can read it would be unfair. If you write Baba Abadad or something like that, I can probably read that pretty quickly and some other words, but other than that, I won't be able to read it much. And because I haven't read it much, sometimes if I hear people speak, or even if I'm speaking, I might not be able to tell you how many words something was, because I don't know exactly how the words break up. If that part of the word is combined, or if it's separated into two different words. It's not always clear to me. But if you're a native Persian speaker who's spoken it all your life, you'll automatically, it almost seems like, how could you not tell that that's 3 words or 5 words or whatever it might be? So we do see so many ways that language is so automatic for us. Again, that doesn't mean just because it feels that way it has to be, but it does point to more of these issues that language is something that as humans we have evolved to be able to do, to be able to be good at. And it has so much value to allow us to communicate in ways that are quite incredible. Of course, it's limited at the same time. But coming back to this concept of words themselves, I think it is interesting to keep this in mind, because sometimes people think, well, I used to say this word, and so shouldn't it be okay for me to say it now? You can't tell me that I can't say it now. But that's the same thing with currency. You can say, well, I used to use this Bitcoin to buy this, and now they're saying, well, it's not as worth as much, or maybe here it's not even accepted at all. And so the same thing happens with words, that sometimes they change value, or sometimes they become virtually unacceptable, or they change meaning quite strongly. For example, the word you, Y-O-U, used to mean only a group of people, but now it's used almost exclusively to mean one person. I say, how are you doing? Now you can say it to a group, and sometimes we do, like let's say I'm seeing a crowd of people, I say, how are you doing? And I mean to everyone. But usually when we say you in a sentence, or we're talking conversationally, we think of one person, whereas before it was exclusively for more than one person. So seeing how words change value can remind us of the socially constructed aspect of it, while also recognizing that it seems like we have a natural disposition to understand, learn languages, comprehend languages in ways that make it easier than learning other things. All right, let's go to our last commercial break. We'll be right back.